You talking to the...
Shh. So yeah, it was that kind of day.
Ah, look at Era talking to the flowers. She's so adorable. I love her.
Learn to talk to her.
Stop talking to flowers, you lunatic! What the hell is wrong with you? The Final Fantasy VII Remake is finally here, and it still feels surreal for me to say that. For the longest time, it felt like the game was never going to be released. But nearly 5 years on from that initial reveal trailer, the finished game is now available to buy on PS4. I wasn't intending on making any kind of review for the Final Fantasy VII Remake, to be honest. But after completing it, I simply have too much I want to say about the game, both from a positive and negative standpoint. However, for me to be able to talk in depth about my thoughts on the remake, I will obviously need to go deep into spoiler territory. So if you want my very brief, spoiler-free opinion on the Final Fantasy VII Remake, I think it's a very good game. About a year ago, I made a video where I basically claimed that Square Enix were going to completely fuck up the Final Fantasy VII Remake, and I called anyone who thought otherwise a face. But after completing the game, I'm happy to put my hand up and admit that I was wrong. Final Fantasy VII Remake is well worth your time and money. I truly believe that there is a lot to love about this game, regardless of whether you've played the original or not. Everything from the characters and world to the combat and music has been handled with the utmost care and respect, and it really shows. However, I still think a lot of people are going to have serious issues with certain aspects of the game, especially its ending. If you are going into the Final Fantasy VII Remake expecting a faithful recreation of the original game's story, you are going to be incredibly disappointed. But I can't say any more without going into spoilers. I decided early on that if I was going to give the remake the review it deserves, I'd have to go really in depth about practically every aspect of the game. I'm also going to be giving my thoughts on the original game too, so you have a better idea of why certain parts of the remake disappointed me. So basically, this is going to be one of my longest videos I've made, and because of that, I'm going to ask that if you'd like to see more content like this, please consider liking this video and subscribing to my channel. It might not sound like much, but it makes a huge difference. I never thought I'd become the kind of guy who begs people to smash that like button, but I guess you learn something about yourself every day.
For so many years, I thought that there was something wrong with me, that I was the black sheep and I needed to change my personality. And after a lot of time and consideration, I realized who I was. I'm a piece of shit.
Also, I need to quickly remind people that anything I say in this video is just my opinion. So if I say something like, Cloud really likes Aerith, you don't need to send me a death threat. It's just an opinion, dude.
Now, let's get into the fun part.
The Final Fantasy VII Remake begins almost identically to the original game, except this time we are given a slightly extended glimpse of the people of Midgar going about their daily lives. We see people working their 9-to-5 jobs, as well as children playing together in the street. I really liked this addition to the opening. It paints Midgar as less of a shithole than we know it to be, and also lets the player see the city through the eyes of its residents. The FMV sequence then cuts to the now iconic scene of Aerith walking the streets of Midgar. The camera slowly begins to pan away from her, showing the incredible scale of the city. The camera then begins to pan back in on another area of the city. We catch a glimpse of mercenary for hire Cloud Strife riding on the back of a train. The train stops and we get to see some security guards getting the living shit beat out of them, which admittedly looks a lot better here than it did in the original game. I'm not sure, but I think that brown blob of pixels just kicked the ass of that red blob of pixels. We then get our first look at Barrett, and the game finally begins. Overall, I was very impressed by how faithful this opening was. It's such an iconic scene at this point, that any deviation from the original would have been considered almost blasphemy. Once we are given control of Cloud, it doesn't take long to see how far we've come in the 23 years since the original Final Fantasy VII was released. The environments are simply stunning to look at, most of the time. The camera can now be fully rotated with the right stick, unlike in the original where it was stationary at all times. It doesn't take long for the player to be thrown into their first fight of the game, and this is where the remake really changes things up. Unlike the original game, combat in Final Fantasy VII Remake is not turn-based. Instead, it takes place fully in real time. Think something like Kingdom Hearts or Senran Kagura, and you've got the general idea. What was I talking about again? Oh yeah, combat is very fast-paced in Final Fantasy. I'm sorry, but can we please just talk about Senran Kagura instead? So Senran Kagura is a series of hack and slash games from Japan. They feature really pretty girls fighting each other with big swords and even bigger tits. Combat is very fast-paced in Final Fantasy VII Remake, with Cloud being able to attack with his Buster Sword at any time by pressing the square button. He can also dodge or block incoming enemy attacks with his sword, and these defensive maneuvers are an aspect of combat you'll have to get used to very quickly, because enemies are relentlessly aggressive in Final Fantasy VII Remake. Simply mashing the attack button over and over is going to get you killed very quickly in most fights. By attacking enemies with regular attacks, you will slowly begin to fill the ATB or active time battle gauge. When an ATB gauge is filled, you can perform more advanced commands, like casting magic spells or using more powerful combat abilities. If the action ever becomes too overwhelming, you can simply press the X button to slow down time and think about your next move. Inputting commands this way feels very similar to the active time battle system from the original game, and it's a nice addition for those players who prefer the slower, more tactical side of JRPG combat. I still love the combat from the original Final Fantasy VII, but I have to admit that it does feel a bit slow and dated compared to more modern JRPGs. Hell, even other turn-based JRPGs like Persona 5 feel much snappier and faster paced than Final Fantasy VII's original combat system. So as much as I love turn-based combat systems, even I have to admit that the gaming industry has made huge strides forward when it comes to combat in RPGs, and going back to this probably isn't the best idea anymore in 2020.
Please welcome back to the Late Show, Matthew McConaughey.
Anyways, your goal in this first chapter is to infiltrate and blow up a nearby Mako reactor. Mako refers to the energy or lifeblood of the planet. If you think about how we in the real world are sucking up the Earth's resources to power our cars or to provide electricity to our buildings, well, this is pretty much the same idea. Cloud has been hired by a group called Avalanche to help them destroy all the Mako reactors that power the city of Midgar, thereby hopefully saving the planet. Basically, imagine if Greta Thunberg became an eco-terrorist and started bombing power stations, and it's pretty much the same thing. Avalanche is led by Barrett Wallace, and at the beginning of the game, he and Cloud don't get along at all. I really enjoyed how their relationship was handled in the remake. Their back and forth banter during the first few hours was frequently hilarious, and I always looked forward to any scene where both of them were on screen together.
Don't overdo it. Don't forget to aim.
Oh yeah? How about I aim for your head?
The original Final Fantasy VII also handled Barret and Cloud's evolving relationship very well, but there's a lot less dialogue during the Midgar section of that game, and so their blossoming friendship takes a little longer to show itself. Barret will start to fight alongside Cloud very early into the game, and this is where the new combat system really starts to come into its own. You are simply given far more tactical options than in the original game. Pressing left or right on the D-pad allows you to switch between all playable characters on the fly. So if you want to, for example, have Barret take out a foe from a distance with his machine gun, while Cloud takes on more nearby enemies, you can do that. If one of your characters is injured and needs to heal up, you can manually move that character away from nearby enemies and have another character defend him until they have healed. These are all options that weren't available to you in the original Final Fantasy VII, by the way. If you needed to heal yourself in the original game, you simply needed to hope and pray that nothing hit you before you got the chance to do so. One major difference between the opening bombing mission in the original Final Fantasy VII and its remake is the length of time it takes to complete this section. The mission only takes about 20 minutes to complete in the original game, while it takes almost an hour in the remake. And this is one of my few big issues with the Final Fantasy VII remake. The pacing is absolutely horrendous at times. Practically every area from the original has been padded out to an almost insulting degree. Sometimes this is a very bad thing and actively hurts the overall quality of the game, but sometimes it can also work in the game's favour. For example, this sequence where Cloud and Aerith hop over rooftops only lasts a handful of seconds in the original, but in the remake it's been expanded on greatly, which is good because it gives Cloud and Aerith some quiet time to get to know each other. Also, some of the dialogue during this section is genuinely hilarious.
It's pretty old. Be careful.
Okay.
Easy now.
You worry too much. I'm not some princess who needs to be coddled. Shit. Gotcha.
Aerith is better than Tifa in every way, fight me in the comments. Getting back to the opening bombing mission, we eventually make it to the reactor's core, and anyone who has played the original will know that this is where we face our first boss fight, the Scorpion Sentinel. If there's one aspect of gameplay that Final Fantasy VII Remake absolutely nails, it's the boss fights. Practically every single one of them is a show stealer. They don't just stand in place like in the original game. Most of them actually use the battlefield to their advantage, and have several different forms. And the Scorpion Sentinel is no exception to this rule. The fight actually starts out quite similar to the one in 1997, with the Scorpion just standing in place and throwing out pretty basic attacks. However, as you begin to whittle down its health, it will mix things up by crawling along the walls and firing missiles at you. During this period of the fight, Cloud's sword attacks are obviously useless, but this teaches the player an important lesson, not to rely on massing square to defeat every enemy in the game. Sometimes you will need to mix up your playstyle by casting magic spells or using long range attacks. Magic is incredibly useful in Final Fantasy VII Remake, not only because magic spells can be incredibly powerful in general, but also because most enemies in the game have weaknesses that the player can exploit by casting specific magic spells. For example, the Scorpion can take an absolute age to kill with standard melee attacks, but by casting lightning spells on it, you'll whittle away its health much faster, and will also cause its stagger gauge to fill up quicker. The stagger gauge is a new feature in Final Fantasy VII Remake, and I'm a huge fan of it. So basically, when you attack an enemy during combat, that enemy's stagger gauge will begin to fill. However, if all you are doing is mashing the square button over and over again to inflict damage on the enemy, this stagger gauge will fill very slowly. If you want to be effective in combat, you will need to try and fill this stagger gauge as quickly as possible. You can accomplish this by using appropriate attacks and spells. For example, the Shinra guards are weak to fire, so using fire-based attacks on them will cause their stagger gauges to fill very quickly. Once the gauge has been filled, the enemy in question will become staggered, allowing you to go to town on them without having to worry about them fighting back. You will also deal far more damage to an enemy while it's in a staggered state. It's a really cool system and reminds me a bit of the combat seen in Final Fantasy XIII. So once the Scorpion is defeated, Cloud and Barret have to escape the reactor before it blows up. And this is one of the first changes made to Final Fantasy VII's original narrative that I'm not a huge fan of. You see, in the original game, Avalanche are very clearly terrorists. Yes, what they are doing could be considered to be in service of the greater good, but there's no denying that their actions do cost the lives of some innocent people. Avalanche are literally going around blowing up massive reactors after all. There's going to be some collateral damage. And the original game never shied away from the fact that in the beginning of the game at least, you are a bad person. It was one of the main aspects of the original game's story that I really appreciated. The good guys and the bad guys aren't so different from each other at the beginning of the game. However, in the remake, Avalanche make it abundantly clear that they do not intend to blow up the reactor, they only wish to dismantle it. But once the members of Avalanche have escaped the reactor, we see the president of Shinra make the call to blow up the reactor himself. He does this so that he can blame Avalanche for the deaths of any people living nearby, and also so Shinra can potentially start another war with Wutai, who Avalanche are apparently affiliated with in this game. And to be honest, this whole scene really confuses me. First of all, this is what happens when Jesse's bomb detonates. Barely anything. Surely it wouldn't take much for Shinra to repair any damage done to the reactor and have it up and running again in no time. And if that's the case, why choose to blow it up yourself? Surely those reactors cost billions to make. Also, why are Cloud and Barret in such a rush to escape from this? I don't know, maybe I missed something, and if so, I apologise. Anyways, shortly after the members of Avalanche escape the reactor, it gets blown sky high, which causes a massive amount of damage to the nearby area. The group make it out onto the streets of Midgar in one piece, and Barret gives a rousing speech to his teammates. Barret is such a fantastic character in the remake. He was already one of my favourite characters in the original, but his characterization has been expanded upon significantly in the remake. He definitely retains his gruff persona for a lot of the game, but you also get a lot more opportunities to see his kinder, funnier side this time around. Barret is voiced by John Eric Bentley, and you can tell that the role means a lot to him, because he really gives the performance his all. This is partly because John was actually a huge fan of the original game, and was delighted when he was offered the role. I'm really looking forward to seeing where John takes the character in part 2. After you and Avalanche split up, you are free to wander the streets of Midgar, and this is easily one of my favourite locations in the entire remake. This section of Midgar is absolutely stunning to look at. Buildings are practically lit up like Christmas trees, and overall, this place just feels more vibrant and alive than practically any other part of Midgar we get to visit in the game. Of course, there is a reason for this. This is the fancy upper class section of Midgar, the place where the rich and famous live, and it's almost unrecognisable from the rest of Midgar, where many people are forced to live in dirty, run-down slums. We didn't get to see a huge amount of this part of Midgar in the original, so it was a joy getting to explore it in the remake. This chapter also lets us see the real damage caused by the reactor explosion, and I'm glad Square didn't choose to shy away from showing the horrific consequences of Avalanche's actions. One of the most controversial decisions Square Enix made when developing the remake was to have Sephiroth make several appearances during the Midgar portion of the game. Anyone who has played the original Final Fantasy VII will know that Sephiroth doesn't make an appearance in that game until after you leave Midgar. He is alluded to a few times during the first few hours of the game, but it's not until you reach the small village of Calm that Cloud finally fills us in on who Sephiroth really is, and this whole sequence is simply storytelling at its finest. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Sephiroth wastes no time making his presence known in the remake. Even as early as the first reactor mission, you get little hints that he might be nearby. Then once Cloud makes it out onto the streets of Midgar, Sephiroth finally makes his presence known and begins to fuck with Cloud's perception of reality. Suddenly, the entire city of Midgar is engulfed in flames, and Cloud has flashbacks to Nibelheim, where his mother was burnt alive in her home. Honestly, I don't really mind Sephiroth appearing so early in the remake. Besides, everyone and their grandmother already knows who he is at this point. Even people who have never played the original Final Fantasy VII know who Sephiroth is. There is no mystery to who this guy is anymore, so it wouldn't have made much sense to wait until the second part to introduce him. Shortly after Cloud's first encounter with Sephiroth, we finally meet the one, the only, Sephiroth. Again. Seriously man, can you piss off for 2 minutes please? We meet Aerith, and this opening interaction between the two of them is just the sweetest thing ever. Every line that comes out of Aerith's mouth just makes you fall more in love with her. And I think a huge reason for this is how good her voice actress is. Brianna White plays Aerith in the remake, and she is just perfect in the role. She captures Aerith's infectious positivity and goofy sense of humour perfectly. She is Aerith basically. Also, check out the video of Brianna reacting to hearing her voice in the game for the first time, because it's like the most fucking adorable thing ever. But as I'm sure some of you have noticed, there's one part of this cutscene I haven't talked about yet, and that's these ghost things that are surrounding Aerith when Cloud first meets her. I can't talk about these things yet without diving deep into late game spoilers, so I'm going to forgo talking about them until later on in the video. Don't worry though, these ghosts are a great addition to the story, and aren't just some nonsensical plot device that the writers pulled out of their asses. Anywho, Cloud eventually ends up cornered by Shinra troops, and has to hold them off until a train passes by that he uses to escape the area. The train that Cloud catches a ride on just so happens to be the same one Barrett and the rest of Avalanche are using to bring them back to the Sector 7 slums. This scene on the train is great, because it allows us to get to know the characters a little better. We get to see how stubborn and close-minded Barrett is at the beginning of the game. He can't stand hearing people talking negatively about Avalanche, because in his mind, everything they are doing is for the good of the planet. He doesn't even stop to consider how the lives of people living in Midgar are being affected by his actions. Eventually, the train arrives at the Sector 7 slums, and we are given some free time to look around the area and talk to the local residents. I'd recommend taking the time to talk to the NPCs in Final Fantasy VII Remake whenever you are given the chance, not only because sometimes they might have useful information for you, but because a lot of dialogue in the game is genuinely hilarious. The original Final Fantasy VII is still a really funny game at times, and thankfully the remake retains that goofy sense of humour, and then some. I laughed out loud a lot while playing the Final Fantasy VII Remake, and I'm sure that even the game's harshest critics will still admit to cracking a smile every now and again at some of the game's dialogue. Anyways, once we have finished looking around the slums, it is time to head to Seventh Heaven, a local bar in the area, that is run by the one, the only Sephiroth. Kidding. This is Tifa. Tifa is Cloud's friend from childhood, and you can tell that the two of them still care deeply for one another. Tifa is great in the remake. She is just as much of a badass as she was in the original, if not more so. She is also my favourite character to play as during combat encounters, mainly because she's the character with the most depth and combo potential. Her fighting style actually reminds me a lot of how Dante fights with his gauntlets in the original Devil May Cry. The story kinda grinds to a halt for the next few hours, as we start spending more time with Tifa and helping out the local residents of Sector 7. This part of the game explains a lot of new mechanics to the player, like how to level up weapons and use materia. If you have played the original, you'll know how many of these systems work already, but new players might take some time to get it all memorized. Materia, for example, refers to these little coloured orbs of shit that when placed in a character's equipment allows them to perform magic. For example, Barrett's Gatling gun that you see here has 2 materia slots, which means you can equip 2 materia while using this weapon. So if you equip fire materia to one of your weapon slots, you can then cast fire magic. There is a bit more to it than that though. Equipping certain materia can also improve a character's stats, like increasing their overall HP. Honestly, it takes some time to get used to the materia system, but once you do, it will become second nature in no time. Upgrading weapons is actually a brand new mechanic introduced in Final Fantasy VII Remake. By leveling up Cloud and the gang, you will gain points that can then be used to level up the various attributes of your weapons. The UI that is used for leveling up your weapons looks a lot more complicated than it actually is. You are usually given a choice between some basic attributes like attack strength, magic strength, and the like. It's a simplistic addition to the game, but I still appreciate it being there. Anyways, as I mentioned earlier, the next few hours of the game will be mostly spent completing tasks for the various townsfolk of Sector 7. These basically work as the game's side quests. Unfortunately, a good 90% of the side quests in the game will feel like boring busy work to most players.
This sucks.
Most of these side quests are too simplistic in nature. Okay, so it looks like I've got to talk to this kid to start the side quest?
You can see me, Kupo? Then you two must be very, very special people. In that case, welcome to the Moogle Emporium. I'm the owner, Moggy.
Oh, I guess that was it. One of the side quests in the game literally requires you to do nothing more than pressing the triangle button on 5 kids with wooden swords on their backs. Like, what is this shit? Now don't get me wrong, there are still side quests and minigames in the Final Fantasy VII Remake that I do enjoy. Darts is surprisingly fun, as are the squat and pull up minigames. Whack-a-Box is one of the strangest fucking things I have ever played, but I'd be lying if I said I didn't have any fun with it. There is even a Colosseum where you can take part in various combat tournaments, which is simply a fantastic addition to the game. I honestly thought we'd have to wait until the Golden Saucer before we saw anything like this. My favourite side quests in the game though are these optional boss fights against the various summons of Final Fantasy VII. So instead of finding summon materia out in the field like in the original Final Fantasy VII, most summons are obtained through these VR battles. You can gain access to these fights by talking to this guy named Chadley. Chadley will give you various missions throughout the game, and by completing them, you can gain access to rare materia and optional fights. The further into the game you progress, the more of these summons you'll be given the opportunity to fight. These bosses are some of the most challenging fights in the entire game, but they are well worth trying to defeat, because if you do, you'll be able to avail of their help later on in the game. Summons work a little differently than they did in the original Final Fantasy VII. For one thing, you can't call upon their help whenever you need them. In the original game, once you had equipped summon materia, you could call upon that summon at any time, as long as you had enough MP to do so. In the remake, however, summons can only be used at specific points in the game, usually boss fights. This limits their usefulness massively, and makes them a lot less useful than in the original Final Fantasy VII. Summons were very overpowered in the original, so I understand why Square decided to limit their usefulness in the remake, but I think a better balance could have been struck, like allowing you to use a summon during any fight, but it completely drains your MP gauge if you do. Anyways, getting back to the slums, I think this might be my least favourite area in the entire game. It takes up a huge chunk of the game's overall playtime, but there is so little to do or see here, outside of mindless side quests and some boring story missions that aren't integral to the main plot whatsoever. However, it is worth pointing out that by completing all side quests in the area, you will get an extra scene where you can choose what kind of dress Tifa should wear during the Wall Street section of the game. I chose sporty, just because Tifa is a sporty type of girl, you know? Not because the dress is more revealing or anything like that.
I need somebody to help me not have a big heart, because my heart is so big.
There really aren't any meaningful plot developments during this chapter either. Yes, we see Sephiroth again, but we don't learn anything from it. As much as I like Final Fantasy VII Remake, there are definitely some points where the pacing slows to a crawl, and Chapter 3 is one of the worst offenders in that regard. Chapter 4 is pretty good though. So towards the end of Chapter 3, Jessie comes to Cloud asking for his help on a mission. She needs to sneak into a Shinra base in order to get bomb supplies. I haven't really talked much about Jessie yet in this review, so I want to take a second to address how her character has been handled in the remake. Overall, I would say that I like Jessie and her character arc in the Final Fantasy VII Remake. She is strong, kind, and can even be hilarious at times.
Keep going till we hit the station?
No, head straight for the warehouse. Aww. Our magical ride is almost at an end.
Why are you talking like we're not here?
Because you're not.
Clearly we are.
We actually get to learn a lot more about Jessie's backstory this time around, in the form of a new area that was never in the original game. My only real issue with Jessie in the remake is how desperate she is to f*** Cloud. Some of the scenes where she flirts with him were a little cringy to say the least. Oh, and every time she said psych, I kinda wanted to scream.
Psych. Welcome home, honey. Took your sweet time. Psych.
Jessie Raspberry.
Anyways, Chapter 4 begins with Cloud, Biggs, Wedge, and Jessie all heading off towards the Shinra base, and this cutscene has some really strange dialogue.
Are your parents still around?
No.
Chapter 4 also contains the first of 2 playable motorcycle sequences in the game, where you have to try and prevent Shinra troops from doing damage to your teammates. This motorcycle section plays fine enough, but slightly outstays its welcome in my opinion. Once you have held off the Shinra troops for long enough, the game introduces you to a brand new character not seen in the original Final Fantasy VII. Rhodes is a soldier 3rd class who we barely get to know anything about during the 15 minutes he's on screen for. We simply fight him in 2 very short, very easy boss fights, and then he fucks off for the rest of the game. I really don't understand what his purpose in the greater narrative is, or if he even has one. Hopefully he'll have a larger role to play in part 2. Upon completing the motorcycle section, Cloud and the gang need to stop off at Jesse's parents' house before they can get inside the Shinra base. This is because Jesse's father used to work for Shinra and has an employee ID that can get them inside. Out of all the new scenes that have been added to the Final Fantasy VII Remake, the ones that expand on Jesse's backstory are my favourite. In the original game, Jessie was just another member of Avalanche. She didn't really have a backstory or character arc, and so it was very hard to care about her in any meaningful way. But in the remake, we actually get answers for why she does the things she does. For example, Jessie only joins Avalanche after her father falls into a coma from Mako poisoning. She is not just some eco-terrorist who loves blowing shit up. Her actions actually make sense in the remake. So once we leave Jessie's house, the next destination is the Shinra base, conveniently located only a few steps away from the house itself. The Shinra base is basically just a large combat arena, and it is one of my favourite fights in the entire game. It is also during this sequence that Cloud has his second face-off against Rose that I mentioned earlier. Once Rose is defeated, Jessie and crew escape the base with the bomb components. They then find a nearby bridge that allows them to parachute directly into the Sector 7 slums. The perfect escape, if you will. Once back in the slums, Jessie becomes really desperate for some reason, and you are given a choice on whether or not you are interested in seeing her the following night. Unfortunately, Final Fantasy VII Remake doesn't contain nearly as many of these dialogue choices as I would have liked. The original game was full of them, and some of your choices would actually change how events in the game would unfold. Once Cloud has said goodnight to Jessie, he heads back to his apartment to sleep. During the night, Tifa visits him for a quick chat. I like this scene because it's one of the first moments in the game where you get to see Cloud's tough exterior begin to soften. He is not sticking around Midgar because he wants to get paid. He's sticking around because he made a promise to Tifa that he'd be there for her if she ever needed him. It's obvious Tifa means a lot to Cloud, even if he's not willing to tell her outright. The next day, Cloud awakens to... this fucking bollocks. The ghosts are back, and this time, they mean business. You actually have to fight them in this sequence, and it's one of the stranger battles in the game. You have to kill these smaller ghosts, because by doing so, you will make the head ghost vulnerable for some reason. Once you have defeated the head ghost, the battle will end and the whispers will vanish. Not everyone has escaped the fight unscathed, however. Jessie is injured and is no longer able to join Avalanche during their next mission, which is to bomb the second Mako reactor. So Cloud steps up and offers to take her place on the mission instead. Funny, isn't it? Jessie never went on that second reactor mission in the original game. It was Cloud, Tifa and Barrett who went instead. It's almost like those ghosts want to keep things that way. I'm rubbing my chin right now. I don't know why I said that, you can't see me doing that. So with Jessie currently indisposed, Cloud, Tifa and Barrett catch a nearby train that will take them close to their destination of Mako Reactor 2. However, during a security scan, Cloud, Tifa and Barrett's true identities are revealed, and they have to fight their way off the train. This escape sequence is massively improved over the one we got in the original Final Fantasy VII. In that game, escaping from the train simply involved running in a straight line, but here you actually have to fight these drones against the clock, and it can be very intense at times. Once the guys reach the end of the train, they decide to jump off and make the rest of the trip on foot. This second Mako Reactor mission is a perfect example of how the Final Fantasy VII Remake will take any opportunity it can get to excessively pad out the length of the game. In the original Final Fantasy VII, this whole area took about half an hour to complete. In the remake, it's closer to 2 hours. That doesn't mean that this location is dreadful in the remake, just that it lasts way longer than it has any right to. Just when you think you are making progress, you are suddenly told that you need to navigate this massive area to find 3 sun lamps and turn them off in order to proceed. Once you have done that, you then need to spend the next half hour fiddling with computers to make the boss fight in the area easier. And that's not mentioning the endless, lifeless hallways you'll have to run down to get anywhere in this chapter. It's simply dreadful level design, and this is easily one of the weakest areas in the game for me. However, it is also during this chapter where the full potential of the game's combat system is finally realized. For the first time in the game, you have access to 3 characters during combat, and swapping between these guys on the fly while creating cool combos and utilizing clever tactics is some of the most fun I've had with a JRPG combat system in a long time. The game also starts to get pretty difficult from this point forward, and learning your enemy's weaknesses becomes a lot more important. Even when Final Fantasy VII Remake isn't firing on all cylinders, the combat consistently keeps things interesting. So towards the end of Chapter 5, an infamous sequence from the original game rears its ugly head again. The synchronized button pressing minigame. Except this time you have to pull levers in sync instead of pushing buttons. Mercifully, the timing required to be successful with this minigame isn't nearly as strict as it was in the original game.
Hell yeah!
We really did it! Great timing. Right on the money.
Yeah.
Could you please stop being such a fucking buzzkill? You are embarrassing me in front of everyone. Even if you do fuck up, it's worth it to hear Barret become more and more frustrated.
Shit!
As in the original, the second Mako reactor chapter ends in a boss fight against the Airbuster, and this is easily one of the best boss fights in the entire game, if for no other reason than the incredible music that plays during this fight. I haven't talked much about the remake soundtrack up until now, but really, what even needs to be said at this point about Final Fantasy VII's soundtrack? It's easily one of the greatest musical scores ever written for a video game, and I still find myself re-listening to it on a nearly weekly basis. The remake takes dozens of tracks from the original game and reworks them into something truly special. The rendition of Those Who Fight Further that plays during the Airbuster boss fight is one of the greatest pieces of music I have ever heard in a video game. Period.
Yep, I hear you loud and clear. Watch yourself.
Taking over. Here we go.
If any game soundtrack ever deserved to be orchestrated, it would be Final Fantasy VII's, and Square did an absolutely stellar job in that regard. There are also many original tracks that were created specifically for the remake, and they are all great for the most part. But let's be honest, they were never going to hold a candle to Yui Matsu's original work. So once the Airbuster is defeated, it explodes and destroys the bridge Cloud and the others were standing on. Barret and Tifa get to safety, but Cloud isn't so lucky. He puts on a brave face, but you can tell he's properly shitting himself right now. In fact, if you look closely, you can actually see little pieces of shit sliding down his pants. Cloud falls from the bridge and plummets right into the Sector 5 slums. However, instead of ending up a crumpled heap atop someone's roof, Cloud miraculously survives. In fact, not only does he survive, he's greeted by this goddess. How the fuck does this guy do it? Even when he is supposed to die, he instead just gets more women fawning over him. Aerith is a flower girl who lives in the Sector 5 slums. She finds Cloud passed out in a flower bed that is somehow growing within the local church. I am not going to spend this whole review talking about how much I love Aerith as a character. What I will say, however, is that Aerith has always been my favourite Final Fantasy character, and the remake has somehow made me love her even more. She has one of the most likable personalities of any video game character ever. She is sweet yet tough, intelligent yet goofy. She is also beautiful, but not in an overtly sexual way. She is one of the best written female characters in gaming, and also serves as a strong role model for young girls to look up to, in my opinion. Cloud is still just getting to know Aerith at this point, so he still puts on his typical cold, distant facade. But over time, Aerith will slowly begin chipping away at that tough exterior to reveal the sweet guy underneath. Did I actually write that? Fucking hell. Unfortunately, this happy moment between Cloud and Aerith doesn't last long before a new face interrupts. This guy is named Reno, and he is a member of the Turks. The Turks work for Sinra, and their job mostly revolves around trying to find new recruits for Soldier, although according to Aerith, they are also known to occasionally dabble in kidnapping and even murder. Aerith understandably doesn't want anything to do with this man, so she hires Cloud to be her bodyguard. The fight between Cloud and Reno is one of my favourites in the game, mainly because it practically forces you to get to grips with mechanics you may have ignored up until now. For example, I wasn't even aware it was possible to parry enemies until I reached this battle. In fact, the fight is almost impossible to win without using this mechanic. After defeating Reno, Cloud is about to deliver the killing blow before the Whispers reappear once more to stop such an event from occurring. This scene really confuses me. I mean, if the Whispers are trying to make sure that the game's story unfolds exactly the same way it did back in 1997, why wouldn't they step in before the fight between Reno and Cloud had even begun? Cloud never actually fought Reno at the church in the original game after all. From here, Cloud and Aerith begin to make their escape from the church. As I mentioned earlier, this entire sequence is very similar to the one from 1997, except there's a lot more dialogue between Cloud and Aerith this time around, which is a plus in my opinion. Upon escaping the area, Aerith invites Cloud over to her place for dinner, but to get there, the two of them need to fight through a dangerous area of Sector 5. This is where the player is finally allowed to control Aerith in battle, and honestly, she just isn't that much fun to play as during combat encounters. Just like Barret, Aerith is a long-range fighter, which means she is far more effective when casting magic attacks from a distance. She also makes for an excellent healer, so it makes sense to keep her away from enemies whenever possible. This is all fine, of course. Aerith is an incredibly useful character to have in a fight, but while Cloud and Tifa's combat styles are both extremely satisfying to mess around with, Aerith just isn't as much fun to play as. As many people have already pointed out, the Final Fantasy VII Remake isn't always the prettiest game to look at. A lot of the time, the environments and character models are simply to die for, but every now and then, you'll catch a glimpse of whatever the fuck this is supposed to be, which really breaks immersion. For whatever reason, the more open environments in FF7 Remake are often home to many areas suffering from seriously low resolution textures. It's not a deal breaker, but it's disappointing that such a polished game lets itself down with this bullshit from time to time. However, with all that being said, the first time I arrived at Aerith's house, my jaw just hit the floor. This is one of the most breathtaking sights in the game. Oh yeah, and the house is pretty nice too. FF7 Remake might not always be the prettiest game ever, but during moments like this, it's difficult to care. This chapter mostly revolves around completing side quests around town with Aerith. As I mentioned earlier, many of these side quests just feel like filler content, but getting to spend more time with Aerith and seeing her relationship with Cloud develop further made it more than worth it for me. After a long day of pissing about, Cloud is introduced to yet another member of the Turks, named Rude. All you need to know about Rude is that he is apparently able to do this to a fully grown man, which makes him the most terrifying villain in the entire Final Fantasy series by default. After defeating Rude, Cloud decides to rest up at Aerith's place. That night, he sneaks away from the house to head towards Sector 7 by himself. However, Aerith is already way ahead of him and catches him trying to sneak away from the area. This next section of the game is where Final Fantasy VII Remake really starts to take the piss. For example, in the original Final Fantasy VII, this entire area can be completed as quickly as this. In the remake, however, not only are there plenty of uninteresting battles against foes that pose barely any threat, but you also have to deal with this complete bullshit. So for some reason, the guys at Square had the genius idea of turning this robot hand from the original game into a fully fledged game mechanic. Cloud has to pick up Aerith with this robot hand thing so that she can knock down a nearby ladder on the other side, allowing the two of them to progress. It's tedious and a complete waste of time, but at least it only takes 2 minutes to complete this section. But then the game decides to use the same robot arm gimmick another 2 fucking times. This is my main complaint with the Final Fantasy VII Remake. For every amazing boss fight or enjoyable cutscene, there's a moment like this that just kills the game's pacing and my enjoyment. Final Fantasy VII Remake was always going to struggle to get 30 hours of enjoyable content out of a single location like Midgar, and sections like this just prove that fact. However, once Cloud and Aerith make it through this location, things pick up significantly. The park scene was always a really sweet moment in the original, but it's been expanded upon greatly in the remake. You can tell that Cloud and Aerith have begun to fall for each other, even though neither of them are ready to open up about their feelings yet. The park is right beside Sector 7, so Cloud prepares to say his goodbyes to Aerith. But before he does, there's one last thing he has to do. Anyways, even though he's clearly reluctant to do so, Cloud knows he now has to leave Aerith behind as he makes his way towards Sector 7. However, before he has a chance to do so, Cloud notices a familiar face in a Chocobo carriage?
Cloud, you're alive. I thought we'd lost you.
What's going on?
Shh. I'll explain everything later. But now I'm on my way to see Don Corneo. You should head back to 7th Heaven, meet up with the gang.
But...
I'll be fine. You've seen how much ass I can kick?
I have.
So Tifa is currently on her way to see Don Corneo, the boss of an area called Wall Market. Cloud and Aerith decide to put their plans on hold for the time being and set off to save Tifa. This next section of the game was one of my favourites in the original Final Fantasy VII, and it has been recreated spectacularly in the remake. I fully expected entire areas of Wall Market to be cut from the remake, but to my great surprise, practically everything is here, even down to the shop with the machine gun. In fact, if anything, Wall Market in the Final Fantasy VII Remake is significantly larger than it was in the original, with new areas to explore and new activities to partake in. Your end goal is still the same as it was in 1997 though. To get into the Don's mansion to rescue Tifa, and just like in the original, Cloud has to cross-dress to get inside. Honestly, the actual task of finding Aerith and Cloud appropriate dresses is far more engaging in the remake. For example, finding Cloud a dress in the original game involved running back and forth through Wall Market, completing very mundane tasks. But in the remake, this quest features an incredible musical sequence that even requires the player to partake in a dancing minigame. Even though Cloud obviously wouldn't be caught dead dancing like this, I still love this part of the game. It's impossible not to have a smile on your face during this entire dance sequence. The higher your score in this minigame, the nicer Cloud's dress will be. This whole sequence at the Honeybee Inn is just legendary. I love it. Getting Aerith a dress is also quite a memorable experience, requiring players to visit a hand massage parlor. The more money you spend in this place, the nicer Aerith's dress will be. Of course, I wanted my girl to look like a star, so I went for the luxury hand massage.
I need somebody to help me not have a big heart, because my heart is so big.
Honestly, there are far too many memorable sequences in Wall Market to mention, but one that instantly springs to mind for me is the incredible fight in the Colosseum against the Hell House. So for those who don't know, the Hell House was an enemy in the original Final Fantasy VII that kinda stuck out like a sore thumb. It didn't quite fit or belong in the game's universe. So when Square finally announced that they were developing an FF7 remake, one enemy everyone was sure wouldn't make the cut was the Hell House. But here it is, redesigned as a spectacular boss fight. Not only that, but this fight is also one of the most challenging in the entire game, and is one of the only times I got a game over during my first playthrough. Anyways, once Cloud and Aerith have found their respective dresses, they head off towards Don Corneo's mansion. Also, have you seen Aerith in this dress? You were really going to tell me you prefer Tifa to this? Y'all crazy. Once inside the mansion, they quickly find Tifa, and Cloud delivers my favourite line in the game.
Cloud? Is that you? Oh my god, that makeup! And that dress!
Nailed it, I know, thank you. Moving on.
Shortly after this reunion, the three of them are called for their meeting with the Don.
Alright! Y'all good to go? Then let's do this thing. Introducing Wall Market's most eligible bachelor, the one and only Don Corneo. Ladies? Nice. Very nice. Whichever one shall I pick? Oh.
This scene is far more sordid and messed up than it was in the original game, which I was quite surprised to see in 2020. Don Corneo is such a sleazeball, and Mark Hamill did an amazing job bringing this guy to life. Honestly, I don't want to spoil any more of this section of the game, because it deserves to be experienced firsthand. So anyways, just like in the original game, Cloud, Aerith and Tifa fall right into the Don's trap and end up in the sewers. Upon regaining consciousness, Cloud finds Tifa and Aerith both lying unconscious on the ground. The player has to choose whether to check up on Aerith or Tifa first. I checked up on Aerith first, not just because I'm very sad and alone, but also because it increases the odds of her showing up in an important cutscene later on. This chapter wastes fuck all time in throwing the player straight into the shit by almost immediately introducing one of the most challenging boss fights in the game, Abzu. As intense and enjoyable as this fight is, once Abzu is defeated, the game's quality falls off a cliff for the next several hours, as you are forced to navigate several boring and lifeless locations in a row. The sewers in the original Final Fantasy VII can be completed in less than 5 minutes, but in the remake it can take upwards of an hour. This would be fine if the level design was interesting, but it's just a series of long linear corridors with very few opportunities to explore. There are no puzzles, unique enemies, or side quests in the area. It's just a long, boring slog until you finally find the exit. But hey, at least once you are out of the sewers, you never have to return to them again, right? Unfortunately, the next location isn't much better. The train graveyard was always one of the most boring locations in the original Final Fantasy VII, but at least it didn't take any longer than 15 minutes to get through. As usual though, the remake has to pad the ever-loving fuck out of every area in the game, and the train graveyard is no exception. However, even though this chapter drags on for far longer than it has any right to, there are still certain things I like about this portion of the game. For one thing, the visuals on display here are gorgeous, and the music is on point too. There are even 2 boss fights to deal with, and they are both among the best in the entire game. At this point in the video, you are probably thinking, wow, this guy has a nice voice. And like, thank you? But what you probably are also thinking is, when is this guy going to get to the point? I can't sit around all day watching videos. I have kids to feed. And while I do sympathize, one of the main things I wanted to accomplish when creating this video was to show how padded the fuck this game is. Midgar in the original FF7 is 5 hours. Midgar in Remake is over 30 hours. That means Remake is over 6 times the length of 1997 Midgar. That is fucking absurd. I wouldn't mind if those 30 hours were full of new and exciting content, but it is nearly always boring filler. It was during these chapters that I began to get frustrated with FF7 Remake's excessive padding, especially because the game could have easily been one of the best JRPGs of the last decade if the developers had just cut some of this filler content. However, if there is one thing I do like about these filler chapters, it's that characters actually have time to get to know each other. For example, Aerith and Tifa become best friends shortly after they first meet in the remake, which is nice because in the original they were more like this.
You know what? This is supposed to be my boyfriend and I'ma tell you. No, this is not your man. This is not your man. What you answer for me? Wait a minute. This your man.
Once you escape the train graveyard, things do thankfully start to pick back up again. One of the most memorable scenes in the original Final Fantasy VII was the dropping of the plate, which ends up killing practically everyone in Sector 7. It was such an effective moment because up until the last minute, it genuinely felt like Cloud, Barret and Tifa were going to successfully stop the plate from collapsing, only for them to fail miserably in the end. It is important to note that death and loss are prevalent themes in Final Fantasy VII, and the game never shies away from showing innocent lives being lost in the most heartbreaking fashion. The remake just doesn't understand what made the original game's story so impactful, and as a result, the dropping of the plate is far less effective this time around. Very few people lose their lives, and overall you are just left to wonder what was the whole point of including the scene at all. I mean, even Wedge and Biggs survived this time around, for Christ's sake. Oh, and don't even get me started on that fucking scene where Aerith rescues Marlene. The plate is about to collapse, but Aerith is just here talking shit with Marlene for what feels like an eternity. Ridiculous. I will admit that Jesse's death was handled pretty well, but knowing Nomura, he'll find some bullshit way of bringing her back to life in part 2. Anyways, despite not liking the narrative choices made in this chapter, I have to admit that the boss fight against the Turks is fucking epic. It's not exactly a challenging fight, but the sheer spectacle of it all more than makes up for it. In both games, Aerith is kidnapped by a member of the Turks and is transported to Sinra Tower. Once the plate has collapsed in the original game, Cloud, Barret and Tifa waste no time in trying to rescue Aerith from Sinra Tower. In the remake, however, you piss around for what feels like an eternity. The game is padded to hell and back from here on out. There is a chapter that takes place in an underground lab that was not in the original game. This entire chapter feels like needless filler and didn't need to be included in the game at all. Even though time is of the essence, completing meaningless side quests around town and helping this dickhead are apparently more important than rescuing Aerith. At one point, you even have to return to the sewers and chase this little shit for half an hour so that you can retrieve a key. You can't make this shit up. All of this stuff is awful and dramatically hurts the game's overall pacing. The scene where Aerith is kidnapped should have been immediately followed by Cloud, Barret and Tifa storming Shinra Tower to rescue her. There's no way Cloud would leave Aerith to suffer while he fucks about doing squats in Wall Market. So I don't want to talk about this bullshit chapter anymore. Eventually, Cloud and crew actually decided it would be a good idea to get Aerith back, so they climbed a plate in order to reach Shinra Tower. Climbing the plate literally took all of 5 minutes in the original, but because this is the remake, say it with me now, it's padded to fucking hell and back. It takes well over an hour to climb the plate in the remake, and much of this time is spent navigating linear empty buildings. Also, what the fuck is this? Did they actually use a low resolution JPEG for the background in this area? What the hell were they thinking? That doesn't mean there aren't good moments in this chapter. As to be expected, the boss fight in this area is fucking awesome. Come to think of it, practically all the bosses in the game are amazing. Whoever designed the boss encounters in the Final Fantasy VII Remake is an actual genius. Once the boss of this area is defeated, it's on to Shinra Tower. This location was always one of the lengthiest dungeons in the original, and the remake is no exception. It's a fun chapter though, featuring plenty of enjoyable combat sequences. Also, quick shout out to this scene, which has to be the most stupid shit I have ever seen in my life. However, just because the combat encounters are enjoyable in this chapter, doesn't mean that there aren't lengthy sequences that exist for no other purpose than to needlessly pad out the length of the game. For example, at one point, Cloud and the others need a keycard in order to proceed further into Shinra Tower. To get the keycard, Tifa needs to, I don't know, use monkey bars or some shit to slowly reach the security cubicle. However, there are still a handful of quiet moments in the Shinra Tower that are genuinely enjoyable, despite the fact there's nothing really interesting happening on screen. For example, both games allow you to reach the 59th floor by taking the stairs instead of the elevator. Doing this allows you to skip a lot of combat encounters. This scene could have easily been one of the most boring in the entire game, but thankfully the dialogue is so strong here that it actually ends up being one of my favourite scenes in the game.
Ask the stairs.
I don't think the stairs are talking.
Well, duh. I mean, duh.
I was joking.
And even better, in the remake, Tifa doesn't resort to calling Barret a, yeah, that. However, despite enjoying sequences like this, there are still some sections that are a complete slog to get through, especially on repeat playthroughs. For example, this area where you are given a virtual guided tour of the Shinra building is just as boring as it sounds. On the plus side, however, the sequence ends with an absolutely breathtaking FMV cutscene, which I consider to be one of the highlights of the entire game. This cutscene gives us a rare glimpse of the ancients before they were wiped off the face of the earth, even if it is just a simulation created by Shinra. However, just as it seems the simulation is coming to an end, Cloud, Barret and Tifa appear on the streets of Midgar, and a familiar face appears before them. It's Sephiroth, and it seems like he's here to give Cloud a glimpse of things to come in the near future. He seemingly kills Tifa and Barret before vanishing into thin air. Thankfully, both of them are okay, and it appears that Cloud must have just been hallucinating. Or was he? Okay, so let me just check what happens after this. Some guy shows up and escorts Cloud and the others to a library. The mayor of Midgar is in the library. They talk to the mayor for a long time, even though nothing of note is really said. He gives Cloud a key card, then you have to piss about for a while asking everyone else about the mayor until someone knows what the fuck you're actually talking about. They give you another key card. Cloud, Barret and Tifa decide to spy on a meeting the president of Shinra is currently having, so they slowly clamber through the longest fucking vent ever. In the original game, this meeting is the first time we get to glimpse what a slime ball Professor Hojo is. Since Aerith is an ancient, she can apparently lead Shinra to the Promised Land, a place that is apparently rife with Mako energy. However, finding such a place could take years, possibly far longer than Aerith's lifespan, so Hojo proposes that they breed her, with a fucking animal. Obviously, shit like this made people feel uncomfortable, even back in 1997, so the scene has been toned down significantly in the remake. That doesn't mean we don't get to see Hojo acting like a complete fucking creep though. The conversation he has with Aerith, where he explicitly details what they did with Aerith's mother when they found her, is fucking brutal.
You're the spitting image of her now. I regret it to this day. If she had only trusted me instead of trying to run, it could have played out quite differently. What a terrible tragedy to lose the last of the pure-blooded ancients. Though not completely, would you like to see your mother? Albeit through the lens of one of my microscopes. Did you really think we'd leave such a precious specimen to rot in the gutter? We collected and cataloged every last bit of her. Hair, skin, organs, every fragment of every bone. As breathtaking in death as in life. As you, my dear. Ifalna was elegance, right down to her cellular structure.
I literally can't wait to rip this guy to shreds. In Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 6, Hojo's Final Hoedown. Eventually, Cloud finds the room where Aerith is imprisoned, and after a short battle, she is finally free and rejoins the team. However, Aerith isn't the only one to escape their prison. This is Red 13, although that is just a codename given to him by Hojo. As people who have actually played the original game will tell you, his real name is Lion Talkie Man III. Red 13 decides to join your team, although he will remain unplayable for the remainder of the game. A lot of people were disappointed by the decision to remove Red 13 as a playable character from the remake, but it actually makes a lot of sense. It would have been unfair to expect Square to spend months programming Red's moveset and abilities if he's only in your squad for the last 2 or 3 hours of the game. Don't worry though, I fully expect him to be playable in Part 2. Anyways, Cloud collapses for some reason, I guess, and awakens sometime later in a room Aerith spent a lot of time in as a child. It is during this cutscene that Aerith shares with us what she knows about the Whispers, although it seems she actually knows more than she's letting on. The group decide to explore the rest of the Shinra building, which brings them to a large room that contains a life form called Xenova. But before Cloud can even begin to comprehend what the hell this thing even is, Sephiroth shows up again for like the fucking, 22nd time? Dude, you know a text message is enough sometimes, right? You are beginning to act like a bit of a stalker. Cloud attacks him, but Sephiroth knocks him back into the area below. Shortly afterwards, Cloud awakens and finds himself in a hidden research facility, which is full of Hojo's discarded experiments. And it is here where Final Fantasy VII Remake's pacing comes to a complete halt, as we are forced to spend the next few hours navigating this boring as shit area trying to find a way out. If it wasn't obvious already, this location wasn't in the original Final Fantasy VII, because that game actually knew what good pacing looked like. This entire section of the game requires you to constantly switch between 2 parties, so you can slowly make your way through the facility. You also have to frequently change out materia, since you'll be switching between the 2 groups often. On top of that, you also have to wait for Red 13 to do this 500,000 times.
Riveting!
Out of all the filler sections in the game, this one pisses me off the most, because when you are this close to the end of the game, the pacing should actually be picking up, not slowing down. There is a decent boss fight at the end of this section of the game, but it's not enough to have made all that filler content worth it. Eventually, the group find an elevator which brings them to the top floor of Shinra Tower. However, something seems off. The building seems to be completely devoid of human life, and on top of that, A trail of strange fluorescent goo seems to lead straight towards the Shinra president's office. I hate this scene in the remake, because it's been heavily censored. In the original game, it's actually a trail of blood, and the dead bodies of Shinra employees line the hallways. All of that is removed in the remake, which greatly diminishes the impact of this scene. Anyways, upon reaching the Shinra president's office, they find him hanging over the side of the building. Barrett saves him and the two get into a heated argument. The president pulls a gun on Barrett, but before he can pull the trigger, this happens.
There is no room for sentiment or guilt.
Again, I'm not a fan of how this scene was handled in the remake. In the original game, the group finds the president with a sword in his back. Upon closer inspection, they find that the sword actually belongs to Sephiroth. At this point in the game, we still have no idea who Sephiroth even is, which adds to his mystique significantly. The developers of the original Final Fantasy VII actually took inspiration from Jaws when creating the character of Sephiroth. In Jaws, the shark isn't actually revealed until very late into the film. That meant when the shark finally did show itself, it had much more of an impact. And the same applies to Sephiroth in the original Final Fantasy VII. In fact, I struggle to think of another video game villain whose build-up is executed as perfectly as Sephiroth's. But of course in the remake, everything is about as subtle as a sledgehammer to the face, so of course Sephiroth once again shows up in the flesh. He kills the president before stabbing Barrett in the chest. This is obviously a shocking turn of events, but you are not given much time to comprehend anything that has just happened before you are thrown into a boss fight against Xenova. This boss fight is unsurprisingly amazing, especially once Xenova's team properly kicks in towards the end of the fight. Once Xenova is defeated, this is where the game's plot really starts to go off the rails. A whisper flies into Barrett's body and essentially brings him back to life. Red 13 claims that the reason Barrett was saved from dying is because Destiny decided it was not yet his time. Who directed this game? Oh yeah, of course. Look, I've already made a video where I talk in depth about the Whispers and their role in the game's narrative, so go check that out if you want to learn more about these guys. Anyways, more wacky shit happens that I couldn't be arsed explaining, before the president's son, Rufus, arrives at Shinra Tower by helicopter. Cloud and Rufus have a one-on-one fight. Well, a two-on-one fight. I'm not the biggest fan of this boss fight, to be honest, because it's completely broken once you realise you can successfully cast Sleep on Rufus and defeat him with no problem. The Rufus fight is immediately followed by yet another boss fight, where you have to take down this tank with Barrett and Aerith. This is an excellent boss fight, and far better than the version from 1997. In the original Final Fantasy VII, the sequence following this boss fight is one of the most iconic moments in all of gaming. Somehow, this moment is even more epic in the remake, with Cloud pulling off some truly mind-blowing maneuvers on a motorcycle.
Let's roll.
Why's he always gotta... Whoa! Whoa! Shit!
The motorcycle minigame appears in both versions, and for the most part, they play identically. There is one key difference though. The sequence in the remake goes on for a fucking eternity. Once Cloud reaches the end of the highway, he sees Sephiroth before him, and from here, everything changes. But I'm not going to talk about any of that in this video. Listen, if I was to talk about the ending in this video, I would just end up getting angry, and I don't like being super negative on my channel. I know a lot of people liked the ending to the Final Fantasy VII Remake, and that's fine, but I didn't. The original Final Fantasy VII means a lot to me. It has, in my opinion, the best story that has ever been written for a video game. Despite its fantasy setting, the game tackles a lot of real world shit. Death, poverty, loss, greed, the planet, love and hate. The game made me feel a wealth of emotions the first time I played it. It is the first game to ever make me cry. It's also the first game where I genuinely hated the main villain. People die in Final Fantasy VII and they don't just come back to life. Just like in real life, the good guys don't always win. The game is also one of the last my dad ever fully completed, and it was wonderful getting to share that experience with him. My dad and me don't have the best relationship anymore. We haven't talked in a long time, so it's nice to revisit this game and remember a time when that wasn't the case. The Final Fantasy VII Remake just doesn't understand why the original story was so impactful back in 1997. Death means nothing in this world. Characters die and are then brought back from the dead hours later. Instead of fighting to save the planet, you are fighting fucking destiny itself. Like the game suddenly became Kingdom Hearts or something. At times, the story feels like bad fanfiction written by a 7-year-old. And yet, I can't deny that I enjoyed a huge amount of the Final Fantasy VII Remake. It is a great game. It has fantastic characters and great combat. The soundtrack is a masterpiece, and the boss fights are amongst the best in the entire genre. Final Fantasy VII Remake is a great game, but it should and could have been a masterpiece. I don't know why I'm choosing to write these words today, but maybe by doing so, some of my guilt will go away. I'm too proud to say these words to your face, but I'm sorry for frequently acting like a complete disgrace. I know I haven't always been the easiest person to deal with. I often get angry and can act like a total prick. But mentally I was in a very bad place. I was self-destructive and wanted to vanish without a trace. My life can sometimes feel like an RPG, trying to level up my stats again so that you'll be proud of me. I'm making progress every day, but it's not a race. Also, remember to subscribe to Inside My Strange Place.